UFO Propulsion Part 2. I made some notes here about some things I wanted to bring up and talk about that I left out from the first video. To start, some basic experiments anyone can do to toy with these ideas of magnetic induction and rotating magnetic fields and things like that. The first one is based on a kind of backyard model of the Glocke or the Bell drive, and an easily found, an accessible, very mundane model of the Bell, which was a ceramic bell-shaped housing with, from what I understand, two kind of rotating toroids filled with some sort of magneto-hydrodynamic fluid, mercury being what they supposedly started with. Anyway, a common household, old school, back in the day thermometer is it's not too far from that. You've got an amount of mercury in a glass cylinder. Glass is your insulator. Mercury is your inductee, your target for current to be induced into. And you can just basically get your thermometer, set it up along parallel to some sort of Helmholtz coil type of arrangement. Have that hooked into an oscilloscope that's hooked into your computer. There's lots of this is kind of for the big shots, for the technically minded. There's a lot of I remember decades ago there was a really expensive software based around creating virtual instruments, which were kind of like waveform analysis software, and fast Fourier transform, this sort of thing, the spectral analysis of inputs and outputs that are construct your own waveform. This is the kind of thing you could hook a TENS unit, a transcutaneous electroneural stimulator, the analgesia device that uses a certain kind of pulse DC current. You could hook that into this and find out what waveform they're using. You could build one of your own or modify that, and anyway, that's interesting. But yeah, a thermometer, it's got the mercury in it, it's got some space to move around in as well, so you could toy with moving around the mercury inside a thermometer with a coil or any kind of electromagnetic apparatus, and you could make the mercury go into bands or move back and forth. And if you were lucky or creative, talented, intuitive, I don't know, whatever any of those words, if you good with experiments, you could produce any number of effects with an oscilloscope, a computer, a Helmholtz coil, and a thermometer. But on the cheaper, in terms of cheaper models of this particular of my propulsion theories for UFOs, would be to get just a 50-cent LED, a light emitting diode, preferably one with long leads. And a light emitting diode is a tiny kind of like a quantum light bulb, a tiny little quantum device that lights up, and it's got two leads coming off of it, and one is positive, one's going to be negative when it's hooked into a circuit, and electricity flows through the device. And it's kind of a situation where there's not enough room, so to speak, for the electrons in the bulb, and some of it ends up making light. It's kind of what we're getting at. I'm not saying you're gonna levitate anything and make the most awesome YouTube ever, but it's definitely a possibility. So you get your LED, and make sure, that's why I said you want one with long leads. You can get them with varying lengths of the wires coming, 2 wires coming off of them. Get some long ones. I like blue. A lot of reasons for that, but not important at this time. And get the LED light, and then the 2 leads coming off of it will just link them together and twist them together into a circle. So then you've got a loop with the light on the end of it. And this is, like I said, a model of the sort of rotating magnetic field UFO stuff that's proposed in the previous video. And then you can get like a Dremel tool or a power drill or something like that, and stick a magnet on there, a spherical magnet or a ring-shaped magnet. If you're really resourceful on the internet, a toroidal magnet, anyway, something like that. A washer shaped magnet would be ideal. That the hole is about the width of the drill bit. Put that on there, and make sure that the leads of your LED were long enough. And you've connected the wires of your LED, and I suppose you could hold the plastic piece, the bulb, and stick the drill with the magnet in there in between, in the middle of that. It's going to need to go really fast, but I'm predicting that the bulb will emit some light, that you'll get some light out of the situation. Now, I'm not predicting it's going to float, or it's going to turn to the massless jelly that you can put your hand through or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but it's a great model to illustrate the concept behind what I proposed in the previous video, and that's the cheaper way to do it. Then you just need a 50-cent LED and some kind of a drill and a magnet. That's pretty down to earth right there. Or you can be a big shot and build a Helmholtz coil and all that other. And then I want to talk about lift versus motive force. It may have become apparent, it kind of stuck out to me after making the first video, that what I was talking about was lift, really, more so than motive force. That this mass manipulation doesn't really factor in genuine propulsion. It's more of a lift force, where you've got like take an airplane, for example, an aerodyne. Aerodyne gets its lift from its shape and interaction with the air, and then its motive force comes from the engine, which is burning and ejecting matter out of the back end, which seems to be where we've been stuck for a long period of time, and, deceptively so. But so lift versus motive force. So mass manipulation, if you want, I described negligible mass and near zero mass, and also zero mass. So negligible mass is kind of idling, you can idle in a safe spot in the geomagnetic field, or a quiet spot in the geomagnetic field, and experience some minor rotation perhaps. And then at negligible mass, of course, more and more energy is required exponentially because of light c squared and the E equals mc squared. That's an exponential arrangement. So the energy interactions of these, it's going to be exponential decay in the way of increasing mass, and it's going to be that uphill, that way in terms of decreasing the mass. So going from negligible mass to near zero mass, it's an immense amount of energy, and going from near zero mass then to zero mass is an immense amount of energy as well. So there's any number of ways, once you achieve lift, to move yourself around. Conceivably, you could have an airplane that, I'm not sure how this will be done, but if it's aerodynamic enough, it could have a sail on it. If the wind blows, it flies a kite, I suppose, or a glider. It's got lift, and its motive force is you threw it. Kinetic energy deposited into the system. But what's interesting about lift versus motive force in this particular case, an example I'll use is the the classic airship sightings of the late 19th century. I don't know if you've maybe read some of Jacques Vallée's early books. He's got a map in the center with the pictures, and it's a map of the United States, and it's got all the sightings, and they're plotted out, and just the dates and everything. And when this airship was seen, and it was this Jules Verne contraption that floated. It had two giant spotlights, one on each end, and these strange metallic propeller type structures all around it, and it floated, and it was going, faster and more maneuverable than anything at the time. And then we see UFOs there, once again, faster and more maneuverable than anything we have at the time. But the point being that there were propellers on this thing. It obviously had some kind of mass reduction. Again, in ancient Hindu scripture we see, and my point is, sometimes things are exactly what they appear to be. The Vimanas from ancient Hindu scriptures, a lot of them have propellers on them, but they also have these bizarre arrangements of mercury drives, and so they get their lift from this exotic mass reduction technology, and their motive force in many ancient cases, and for us Victorian cases, propellers sufficed. There may have even been before that, amongst the flying cults of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, these vehicles with sails on them. There are sightings, once again mentioned in some of Jacques Vallée's books, of ships with sails in the sky flying around. So again, if you've got some kind of arrangement of inductive fields and the reverse photoelectric effect, light, once again, even the airship from the 19th century in the United States had it consistently and constantly emitted large amounts of light from these spotlights on either end. This brings me to another kind of side point and anecdotal point is, if you watch a lot of the UFO videos, a lot of the good ones, when a massive amount of light is released from the object, well, like let's say that it's some sort of Star Wars space shuttle looking object with, side wings, and it's got an obvious fuselage, and then there's a light on the end of it where you would think an engine or exhaust was. Well, at that point you can see the structure of the vehicle, but as the light gets brighter because it's about to execute a complex maneuver or massive or a large acceleration, the light becomes so bright it obscures the entirety of the vehicle, and you don't know if you're looking at a saucer or a cylinder or a sphere or you have no clue. But at a certain point the light is so bright and obscurative that it is a sphere regardless of what the structure of the actual machine, the vehicle, is. Anyway, the airship from the 19th century sightings, and there were many, and they're plotted, and it traversed the country had a timetable, and some reports that landed and dudes got out, talked to people, they were human beings. We don't know if the entire crew was human, but we do know some dudes got out and they were human. As for water, oil, things like that, obviously they were tinkering around. They needed to do some work on their machine. My personal opinion is these were this was a product of the flying cults, that had been studying the Hindus and who knows what else. And I personally also am of the opinion that a lot of the science done in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, even into the 20th century, was kind of a ruse, to further this engineering work. An example would be the benchmark experiment that disproved the luminiferous ether. Required a massive amount of mercury. They floated the interferometer type device on this pan of deep mercury, and I think that may have well been just an excuse for any scientist to get his hands on a large amount of mercury that he could then oh well, what did you do with the mercury after the experiment? You disproved luminiferous ether. I was repeating the experiment. I wanted to make sure that it was truly disproved. What did you do with all that mercury? Oh, we disposed of it. No big deal. It's toxic. We had to get rid of it. Yeah, you had to get rid of it. So it was gone, and that just happens to be the primary component in a lot of these mass production technologies for these exotic flying vehicles. There you go. Because, first chance humanity gets in the 20th century, they come up with the fabric of space-time, which sounds a lot like a medium, which the luminiferous ether was. And they spent 100, 200 years disproving it, only to invent later on the fabric of space-time. Dun, dun, dun. So, lift versus motive force. And then on the more exotic end of the spectrum, if your vehicle is producing powerful magnetic fields, one would only have to put a monopole, in one direction, and then and there are satellites now that can manipulate the polarity of their magnetic field of the satellite, and it comes into conflict with the Earth's magnetic field. It produces a small enough amount of thrust to maneuver a satellite for an extremely low amount of energy. Your UFO could just orient its polarity, its magnetic pole arrangement, or merge the poles into a monopole in a variety of ways, or you could consider an electric field and an electromagnetic field, and sort of if it were a fractal in nature, you could put a strange attractor, and that would be a pole, so to speak, and then pull the craft in a direction within the geomagnetic field. And if the mass was low enough, the interplanetary magnetic field would suffice the heliomagnetic field. But in deep space, this might be problematic to a certain extent. So, there's electrostatics that they use on the stealth bomber and stealth fighters and stuff like that. That has to do with the properties of ceramics involved in the absorbing the radar and all that. But it just happened to be electrostatic as well. But or a jet engine, or like I said, a propeller, or it just doesn't matter. Any number of, motive force plans. Use your imagination. The key is the mass reduction of the, kind of rotating magnetic field. And something else that reminds me of, it doesn't necessarily have to be a rotating magnetic field that inducts a current in an outside ring, or it also, the rotating magnetic field could induce a current in something central to the construction, like the drives on the early German craft. They rotated, the rotating piece was on the outside, and the inside was a sphere filled with mercury. It was an advancement on the Bell drive. It was called some kind of cheesy photonic something name. I'm still doing a bit of work on that, but I find it fascinating. But it can be the interior or the exterior because the field's rotating. And then that interior brings me to a point here, a note I made about toroidal magnetic fields. A toroidal magnetic field, a donut, toroid's donut. If I have a ferromagnet, just a metallic metal magnet, and it's in the shape of a toroid, due to the way the field is structured and its poles and everything, at the center of the donut, in the empty space in the center of the donut, there is a field line that goes through the hole at the exact center point where the magnetic flux is near infinite. And can be described as a scalar phenomena. A scalar phenomena, quite simply put, is just missing a dimension. It's a point field or a line field. It's one-dimensional, two-dimensional. It's missing a dimension or two, and we call that scalar. I think I mentioned that as I was talking about the drives used on the Honebus that were manufactured in Honneberg, Germany, towards the end of the war, because they have 4 of these drives. They look like a half sphere underneath the craft, and I think that it's a central sphere filled with mercury, and of course it has a rotating disc with a certain particular flow of charge through it, and that toroid, they take advantage of that near infinite line of flux going through that sphere, and it appears that due to the way the charge flows through the machine, that the poles, the machine as a whole, its north-south poles rapidly alternate, and that's creating some kind of exotic effect. But once again, to me, that seems overcomplicated, and the basis of the phenomena is just the reverse photoelectric effect and an induced magnetic field to create a semi, closed system, so that you don't, so you can cheat thermodynamics. But and then I had someone ask me one time about, well, these crafts are really going fast, and what about air friction? So, well, that's an issue, to be certain, an engineering one though. It's not really all that super important to a theoretical model, but it was a question that stymied me at first, and definitely I don't see it being a problem at zero mass, but and at near zero mass perhaps not as much of a problem. But going fast, going Mach 20, your airframe heats up big time, even if it's not an airframe. So no amount of aerodynamics is gonna handle that. So the response then is, I think, an exotic arrangement of transductive materials, or exotic arrangements of material science. Very cunning use of material science. And I mentioned some things here like complex arrangements of transductive materials and transductive coupling. Now, what that's talking about is, well, I call it energy laundering, for lack of a better metaphor. But essentially, let's say you got your thermoelectric materials that can turn heat into electricity, or electricity into heat. You got your piezoelectric materials that turn vibration into electricity, or electricity into vibration. You got your photoelectric materials that turn light into electricity, or electricity into light. You got these different kinds of transductive materials. Let's say you just layer a composite, make a composite material, make the whole of your craft out of this. You can kind of this is not so much cheating the system as going further and abusing the system. As an example, I describe here something just for fun. I call it a thermoelectric plasma bomb. How awesome is that? But this thermoelectric plasma bomb is really all it is a thermoelectric sphere with a big ass capacitor in it, and you drop it from orbit, and it's going through the atmosphere and it's heating up, and that heat is transduced into electricity because the spherical shell of the device is thermoelectric. So you're getting this for free because you dropped it through, from orbit. You drop it from orbit, it's hurtling through the atmosphere. I call it a vicarious heat shielding. But and it's heating up, and then that heat is transduced into electricity. It goes into the capacitor. Now, if the electricity didn't go anywhere, for example, into the capacitor, you would have issue, because you've got to launder this energy. You've got to, these craft, what they're doing is they're taking energy, they're moving it around, they're turning it into this kind of energy, turning that energy into this kind of energy, until they get the kind of energy they want. Then they apply it, then they use that type of energy for the application they so choose, having laundered it through different kinds of other energies. And Anyway, the thermoelectric plasma bomb, basically, so it's got this sphere with a giant capacitor in the center of it. It's heating up. That heat is being transduced into electricity, which is filling the capacitor. Of course, you've done the math ahead of time, as to the thickness of the shell, the mass of the device, and how long it's going to take, how long at terminal velocity it's going to take to hit the ground. And you don't want the capacitor to reach maximum capacity before it hits the ground, because then it'll blow up before it hits the ground, unless you want an airburst, and then you would actually factor that into your math, and it would blow up, and it would be an electrical bomb. The capacitor would detonate itself, and lightning would shoot out in different directions, or arc. It would go where, how lightning is. I mean, electrons, they go where they are most likely to go. So I'm imagining if it were about to hit the ground and there were a tower, a bolt would go from the bomb to the tower, and then the bomb would impact with its kinetic force that had accumulated on the way down. But however, if you don't fill the capacitor and it reaches near capacity as it impacts, then you have the sphere impacts the ground, and with the force attributed to however much time the force, its mass and terminal velocity, boom, impact damage, and then all this stuff flies everywhere, and then the capacitor discharges, you get this cloud of plasma. Plasma being the fourth state of matter, it's just charged particles. Your electrons and neutrons have all gone AWOL from the atom and then flying around. Electrons and protons, that is, charged particles, are all flying around. It's a charged gas. It's like a charged gas, plasma. Anyway, the idea is illustrating that like I described in the first video, you cheat thermodynamics by laundering this energy, by transducing this energy into other forms and taking it from this, in this case, taking the heat, turning it into electricity, storing it in the capacitor, and then getting a 1-2 punch bomb strike, because you got the kinetic force of the bomb and its mass, and then all that charge that's built up in that capacitor. I'm talking about a big capacitor, a powerful capacitor, and then so that happens. A trivial note is that counts as a conventional weapon, by the way. That's not nuclear. You don't have fallout radiation or anything like that, and that would be extremely handy if you had an enemy that was hiding beneath a mile thick sheet of ice. That would be pretty cool, because you could drop a series of these things from orbit, and the second one you would drop further out to exactly correlate with the rotation of the Earth, so they would come down in series, one behind the other, and the first one would impact the ice, burrow down in, melt a ton of ice with the plasma discharge, and then the next one would hit the bottom of that hollowed out region created by the first one and do the same thing, and then the last one, if you do your math correctly, once again, it's a whole lot of calculations involved. Not the kind of math I could easily do. Definitely need a calculator, that kind of thing. But you do all the calculations, you drop the right number of bombs, and you've staggered them all correctly from orbit. They would burrow down, and then you would have a tunnel, and then you could drop whatever you wanted down there to take out your target, or just the same bombs, because they'd be conventional. And this is very similar to a lot of the idea of the bunker busters that we've developed conventionally over the years, the Excalibur nukes and stuff like that, but are just dirty weapons. You don't want to use dirty weapons. That's not cool anymore. So that was rambling, but that was thermoelectricity, and that's a possible solution. I was discussing about air friction. So air friction, thermoelectrics probably involved in that. Some of these materials may be like When I say exotic, like a composite materials, you could have um, a weave of, you have the whole of the craft is certain one metal, the majority of it, and then woven, like a spider weave in the sheet metal itself is another metal, and one is photoelectric and one is something else. One is one transductive type and another is another transductive type, and the current flows through the web, and then and then you got the light shoots off. The light is emitted from the exterior of the web metal, or layers, depending on how, any number of arrangements, even down to the molecular level. I drew a little picture for that. In this particular, let's see if there we go. It's this here. You see that decagon structure? That's aluminum, and the dot in the middle is copper, and so if I have an aluminum crystal, and then each inside, and it's a decagon shaped, structure, like a D10 in from like Dungeons and Dragons, from Dungeons and Dragons dice, and then at the center of each of those is a single atom of copper, and I induce a current. I can induce a current, and only the copper atoms. And a human bone is built sort of like this. We're using single copper atoms to bind together certain elements into a subunit. But let's see. Anyway, yeah, that's an example of how to use a crystal like that, a metallic crystal. And so the idea there is that I induce a current, and the aluminum is not good at having a current induced into it. The copper is, and then each copper atom is isolated from the other copper atoms by the aluminum. So I'm inducing a current into a single atom, and the current can't go anywhere if the outside, if the atoms surrounding it are not conductive, or as conductive, or easily conducive to conducting. And in that situation, then the electrons, they go to their maximum orbit shells, and that's the best they can do. I've added this much energy to that system, and then the only thing that's left to happen is photons to be emitted, and then you've got some light there, and you've got kind of once again, I feel a little overcomplicated reverse photoelectric effect. So let's see. I'll save that for the end. Then I wanted to say something in general about UFO technology. A lot of eyewitness reports, they always seem to talk about a common theme, and that common theme being the vehicle I saw has no rivets, seams, or welds. Now that's fascinating. How does this come about? And I have a theory, and I call it a magnaforge. And I believe that these things may be forged magnetically. For example, The basic idea is out in space, releasing some molten metal, producing a powerful magnetic field. As the metal cools, it assumes the shape of that magnetic field. That's the gist of it there. It's similar to what's called it's similar in theory to what's called paleomagnetism, which is how do we know the state of the geomagnetic field 100 million years ago, 200 million years ago, 300 million years ago? Well, how we know this is from the cooled lava. So lava has metallic elements in it, and it's also in a liquid form, and so the lava comes out. As the lava cools, all of the metallic elements in the lava assume an orientation according to the Earth's magnetic field at the time that it cools. And we can then deduce from a piece of lava, we can go into it, analyze this, and we can deduce the state, the relative, the direction, angle, flux, intensity, all these different characteristics of the geomagnetic field at the time that the lava cooled. Well, this is an exploitation of that basic principle, in that, I mean, in the depths of space, it's really cold, and I can shoot out some molten metal and produce a powerful magnetic field, and then as it cools, it'll assume the form of that. Now, any amount of gravity will disturb this process, to be sure. So, where do you do it? You do it at a Lagrange point. You do it where, relativistically speaking, the net gravitic effects are zero. Lagrange point is a sweet spot in the local gravity field out in the solar system. They're ideal for long-range satellites, and a lot of they're ideal for many things and many purposes. A great place to put a space station or something like that, park your mothership, whatever you want to do, Well, Lagrange point is essentially a sweet spot in the local gravity field, to where there's a lot of vector cancellation involved between all the different interactions of gravity of different bodies and different motions and all this, that, and the other, equaling zero at this particular point for a variety of reasons known and unknown. And we call that a Lagrange point for the guy that discovered that theorized these things. So you go to your Lagrange point, set up shop. You got a shipyard arrangement, station, whatever, and that way your gravity doesn't influence. You set up your powerful magnetic field, release your molten metal. As it cools, it assumes the form of that field. There you have your rivetless, seamless, weldless craft hull. And also, in addition to that, you have the decided advantage of the type of magnetic field. When I say type, I mean was it produced by a DC current, an alternating current? Was there a waveform involved? Was its particular orientation and things like that? The quality of that magnetic field, it's got a permanent imprint, a fingerprint, is a signature, a permanent signature on whatever it is you just crafted with this MagnaForge kind of principle. And a similar magnetic field applied at a later date may be highly conducive to altering that structure. So, a lot of these vehicles, we consistently hear reports of the door appeared on the side of the craft, and the door there's no Star Trek-y doors opening and closing or anything like that. Some have those, then the ladder comes out or whatever. Curiously enough, a lot of these crafts have advanced as we have advanced, which begs many questions. But I think that has more to do with, predominantly the operators we see using these vehicles or coming in and out of these vehicles tend to be human, not non-human. That tells us a lot, but that's for another video. And so my idea there is this MagnaForge principle, that powerful magnetic fields shape molten metal that cools rapidly in the vacuum of space at a Lagrange point to avoid any gravity disturbances causing imperfections in the hull. Alright, that's a cool idea I wanted to include. Another cool idea I wanted to include was, a lot of this I'm talking about is about mass manipulation, and a lot of UFO reports refer to solid light We get this kind of reports of like tractor beams and people getting knocked down by light and lifted up by light, and light having a physical effect on the surroundings, the environment. Well, I think that may have something to do with, at higher levels of understanding of this mass manipulation technology. I think that not only can you take an object of matter and reduce it to zero mass, giving it many of the properties of light, I think you can then in turn add mass to light, giving it many of the properties of matter. So I think that there's I mentioned in the first video, I tend to think of things in terms of light, charge, and mass. And so you can kind of create a triangle and see how, and get a lot of creative inspiration from how these things may interact with each other. One of those interactions is light with mass, and the other one is matter would be one of those hybrid of 2 points of the triangle things, and you could take the mass away, and then you have matter without mass that may behave in some ways like light. Like I mentioned, that at zero mass, the very intent of consciousness itself may be enough motive force, which I think was had a lot to do with what the Otis car vehicles were doing, and why they were unpredictable. Let's put it that way. Then I have here the possibility of an exotic disk merely spinning in the geomagnetic field to produce reduction in mass. So if your material science is advanced enough, or exotic, I prefer the word exotic to the word advanced. Primitive often has to be used, but advanced seems a little judgmental. But if your material science is exotic enough, there may be a metal of such quality that just merely spinning in the magnetic field of a planet with a decently powered magnetic field may be enough to create a lifting force or a negation of mass. It would still need some way of doing that spinning, but like I was talking about with the propellers on the 19th century airship, you could have some guys in there, turning cranks to make the thing go around. You may, I don't know if it's a trivial note, but in World War II, the Germans attacked Poland. The Polish tanks, they had to be turned. The turrets and the tanks had to be turned by the guys in there. So the German tanks, motorized turrets, they just got behind them. Then they couldn't turn, the Polish tank crews couldn't turn their turrets fast enough. It sucked. Let's see. And then here's an interesting question I like to ask, something that bothers me. You can talk about Einstein, Heisenberg, Schrodinger, Niels Bohr, all these big shots, all the big shots of the 30s and the 40s in physics. The question is, not did they know about these things, but how did they not know? Because, from my perspective and the models that I'm proposing, these things become that there's no possible way that, upon the third or fourth referential citing or report data, that Einstein could not possibly not know exactly how these things function. I mean, he got his PhD on the photoelectric effect. He wrote the equation E equals mc squared. That there's no way that he could not have fully understood this technology. What I say here is that they would have known. How did they could they not know? To me, it's baffling. It's just an utterly baffling idea that they would not understand these things. And it got pretty popular in the 50s, didn't it? I mean, there were waves upon waves upon waves of sightings. There was the contactee movement, all sorts of. The buzz was heavy enough that, in 1947, an entire new branch of the military, the Air Force, had to be formed. The CIA, an entire new intelligence agency, had to be formed, both to control this issue. And then I have something cool. I'm a big fan of the Dune movie. I know it's been widely panned as a cult classic, but when I was talking about energy laundering and taking one type of energy and turning it into another, the weirding module is something I really spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to reverse engineer this weirding module. I just thought it was the coolest thing. It was obviously turning the sound of the wielder into an I think it's obviously a soliton that it's discharging, which is like a rogue wave is what like a rogue wave that is responsible for capsizing ships. It's a single wave peak. It could be defined as scalar because it's once again lacking in a dimension. But I prefer the more accurate term from physics, the soliton. But it's a single wave peak, and so it's the pulsiest of pulse. It is the minimum pulse. Minimum to be even characterized as a pulse is a single wave peak, and it almost seems like it's not only based around feedback loops, and in this particular case a positive feedback loop, because as the forces positive feedback loop becomes more intense as it loops around, and negative feedback loop spirals into zero, positive feedback loop spirals out to infinity, and a locked feedback loop is stable and stays. So it's I thought the weirding module was cool because it's definitely an instance of this kind of energy laundering, and it seems almost like sound and electromagnetism may be phase locked, and so it's a composite wave of sound, of vibration, and electromagnetism, and that may be what I'll get to in a moment, the quasi-particle, which is I'll read the definition of that. But so my idea then, my point being with the weirding module is that these UFO craft, given that they are may be taking advantage of multiple types of transductive materials, they're essentially flying weirding modules. They're turning vibration into electricity into light, and whatever it is they have to do. So if you wanted to be the Flash in the comics that vibrates through a wall, well, then you've just got to launder your energy into vibration, vibrate the craft, go through a solid, things like that. That's all assuming that what they say about the atom being mostly empty space is true, which I'm beginning to have some differences with. So the last thing is the concept of the day. It is the boil your noodle concept, the Magnon Bose-Einstein condensate. How cool is that? The Magnon Bose-Einstein condensate. Well, as it turns out, there are not four states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. There is a fifth state of matter called the Bose-Einstein condensate. And the Bose-Einstein condensate is at extremely low temperatures. The wave functions of many atoms become the same, and it distills into a macro atom, one giant atom with the quantum behavior of a single atom, even though it initially was, billions of atoms necessary to make a pound of material or whatever. And these have been produced in the laboratory. And a magnon is a quasi-particle, and a quasi-particle is a number of types of vibration or excitation in solids can act as if they were quantum particles traveling through the material. Although there is no physical particle independent of the material, these quasi-particles behave like their real equivalents, quantum particles. Quasi-particles include phonons that are quantized sound-like vibrations, excitons, a combination of an electron and the hole it leaves behind in a semiconductor. This is what all of our technology is based on currently. Polaritrons, an exciton interacting with a photon, again, computers and this, that, and the other. Then the magnon, that's my favorite. The magnon is the collective action of electron spins in a crystal responsible for permanent magnetism. So you have the reason a magnet does what it does is because all the electrons are moving in synchrony in such a way that nearby electrons outside of the material want to do the same. So I usually, in layman's terms, describe magnetism as electron peer pressure, because when a lot of electrons are doing the same thing, nearby electrons, they want to do the same thing too. And this is also somewhat, the metaphor is a little relevant to the phenomena of tunneling, but that's again for another day. And plasmons, which are their own really cool thing that has to do with plasma, basically kind of waves of vibration in plasmas, which are just a chaotic mess of positive and negative particles, protons and electrons, the fourth state of matter. So the magnon, when it gets interesting, is it's very similar, if you know how an MRI machine works, that the powerful magnetic field changes all of the magnetic spin, the magnetic moments of a lot of atoms. These magnetic spin, magnetic moments, you can think of that as every atom as a compass, has north-south orientation. We call this the magnetic moment of that atom. When they're aligned, they're all the same, then you get properties. When they're all canceling each other out, you don't. So the powerful magnetic field adds symmetry to the magnetic spins and moments of the atoms of the body, a certain type of atom. I believe it's the hydrogen ion in the water in your body, but and when they slingshot back to their original position after the magnetic field is turned off, that's when it goes na 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 na. Then radio waves are emitted, photons are emitted, because when you add electrons are heavily influenced. When they go back to where they want it to be, they tend to emit a photon. So in that case, the magnetic field can be considered a virtual photon, even though it is not technically adding energy to the system. It is demonstrably changing things. And anyway, when they slingshot back to their preferred state of disarray, photons are emitted. These photons are then turned into an image, because the photons are proportional to the resumption of that state of disarray after having forced symmetry upon the system. And that image is then the X-ray type, the seeing within the body of the MRI type effect. So anyway, the magnon Bose-Einstein condensate. So now I'm talking about a truly exotic UFO, something really cool. And what this would be is a UFO that becomes, for all practical intents and purposes, a single atom, a single particle even. Because remember, there's quasi-particles, although the magnon is a sort of moving phenomenon. We could call it a wave, or it's a clustered event of changes in spin or magnetic moment moving through a substance or material. It is that cluster of effect counts as a single particle. That's the whole idea behind a quasi-particle, is that an excitation of any number of particles moving that is a group excitation moving through a material or substance is itself treated as a one single particle. So if we have like a metal vehicle or your UFO disc, and I've created a powerful magnetic field that's moving, that's creating a magnetic spin fluctuation through the vehicle, and that magnetic spin fluctuation as it moves through the vehicle is treated as a single particle, and then it can sort of become large enough, powerful enough that the excitation fills the vehicle, fills out the entire structure, and you have a magnetic excitation, so to speak, that is treated as one quasi-particle, and that quasi-particle then has all the characteristics of a quantum particle: uncertainty, tunneling, all the fun stuff that quantum particles can do. And then your Bose-Einstein condensate, the macro atom, you know, when you cool a group of atoms down to a certain temperature, their wave functions, you know, the wave function comes from Schrodinger, and that's the kind of the predictive basis of where we find something. You know, I mean, it's like your couch in the living room. It's only there because it's most likely to be there, and it's also only there because you perceive it to be there, you have measured it to be there, you have influenced the system. But there is a chance, however small, in the Schrodinger wave that couch actually exists in Alpha Centauri and is floating out in space somewhere in Alpha Centauri. But the probability is so low, it didn't happen to manifest there because it was most likely to manifest in your living room. And a direct influence of that manifestation is your own consciousness, which you're in perception being an active process, a process of measurement, and quantum physics tells us measurement disturbs the system. When we you know, it's not that the watch pot never boils, it's that the pot doesn't boil unless it's watched. So anyway, the idea, this is the noodle boiling, I mean, this is all for fun, is that a truly exotic UFO could become a Magnon Bose-Einstein condensate, and then the entire vehicle and its occupants would then be treated as a single quantum particle. And then that's where the coolness, they would be subject to the rules of uncertainty and tunneling. You know, there'd be no barrier that it could not move through. It could go anywhere if they just decided that we perceive ourselves as being there, then we're there. Because, for example, you know, there's a certain probability this UFO is in Alpha Centauri, and if the occupants decide, they have consciousness, they measure, they disturb the system, they let's say, for example, remote view Alpha Centauri, and they decide that that's where they perceive themselves somehow. That's an exercise of the will, and that's for again another topic for another day. But then they would be there. You know, possibly even more than one place at once. I don't know. Probably not. But they could tunnel through things. No barrier could stop them. They could exercise they would have wave-particle duality. Are they a wave? Are they a particle? Whatever they need to be at the time. You know, I mean, that would be quite a vehicle. That would be pretty pimping. Be a G-ride, so to speak. Anyway, that's the hour. I believe that will be it for UFO propulsion. The next UFO technology video will be power sources, and then hopefully I will get around to doing some other videos on some other cool topics. Like I think the next one I would like to do is called Apocalyptic Cycles and Breakaway Civilizations.